So what I'd like to do in this screencast is look a little bit at the role and the importance of audience in non-fiction texts. Most of the exam boards examine this. Quite a few of the questions that you'll have coming up in the exam will link into audience. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the role and function of audience, and then linking into that the tone of a piece of writing, how that fits in with audience, and then how audience and purpose fit together as well. So what we intend to do then is learn about the importance of audience in shaping texts, and that's an important word that we'll come back to because audiences very much shape the sort of texts that we read. Then exploring the ways in which writers use language, images and structure to appeal to different audiences, and that idea there is important as well because writers are writing to appeal to certain groups of people, otherwise they don't get read. And then thinking about the effect of decisions on the audience is another key word, and then considering how to use these techniques in your own writing. We'll see how we get on with that. We may come back to that in a different screencast, but we'll certainly focus here on sort of the reading element and how important the reading element is in many of the GCSE syllabuses. Okay, so what I'd like to do first is I'd like to talk through 5 key principles, 5 key questions that I think are worthwhile you understanding. And these really are media studies terms, but of course the GCSE non-fiction, the English language element, there is a strong media element. So I think it's quite useful for you to have a bit of an overview of what we mean by these key terms. So the first one we'll look at is targeting. So what we need to think about is how are the different texts aimed at particular audiences. What techniques are used to target and interest the particular groups? So how is it done? It might be through things like the use of images. It might be the use of a particular vocabulary. It might be, of course, subject matter. Writers in the media are writing for an audience, and they have to target an audience, and they do this in specific ways. There are specific ways in which specific audiences are targeted. So think about the idea of appeal. How do texts appeal to different audiences? What is it that makes them attractive? What is it that makes people want to read them in the first place, and then once they've started reading them, want to read on? The second point here that's worth bearing in mind before we start looking at texts in any sort of detail is how texts address their audience. By that I mean, how do they speak to their audiences? How do they address them? Is it formally? Is it informally? And so on and so forth. What is it that the text is trying to say to the audience, and in what way do they say it? And then we think about things like, in the same way, think about things like vocabulary. Are they addressing them in a formal way, an informal way? Are they assuming knowledge? Are they assuming ignorance? And so on and so forth. Things like the use of sentence structure as well. So how much does a text assume of its audience? And then therefore how does it address them? Is it addressing them as people in the know? Is it addressing them as people who need to know? And so on and so forth. Is it addressing them as people who want to know titillating facts about a subject? Is it addressing them as people who want to learn more details? Is it addressing young people, old people, and so on and so forth? So the way in which a text speaks to its audience is a key thing to bear in mind. Another key media studies term, which is I think worth at least holding in the back of your mind, is how do we use these texts? How do we use the media in our lives as an audience? You know, what are our habits? What are our patterns of use? When do we use it? Because how we use it determines what is the way in which it's structured. So, for example, are we using it to be informed? Is it for information? Are we using it to intrigue us about, I don't know, celebrities? Are we using it because somehow we feel that we need to share our opinions with others? You know, that we might read a certain text because it backs up our own point of view. So all these different ways in which we use text, it's going to affect the way in which the text is structured, because a writer will write a text expecting the text to be used in a certain way. So the writer has expectations as well as the reader. Fairly obvious one, really. How do we make sense of what we read, what we see? How do we make meaning from the texts? And how do these meanings differ depending on the audiences? You can have two completely different readings of exactly the same newspaper article, or exactly the same event can be interpreted in two very, very different ways. So you think you need to think about the way in which the media are very much shaping the message so that we make sense of it in a certain way, that the media are between us and the things that happen. I'll come on to that in more detail in a moment. But we're making sense. This is a process of making sense of what we're reading, and different audiences will make sense of different things, different stories and articles and what have you, in different ways. But it's this idea of meaning which is important. And then this idea of social difference, what we call a demographic. And a demographic is the group that we belong to. And demographic can link to age, it can link to gender, it can link to social class, and so on and so forth. So the texts will appeal to different demographics, different social groups, and these differences we can say are both shape the media and are shaped by the media. I'll talk about that in more detail in a moment. You know, you can have one newspaper article and it could be read in a very different way by different groups of people, depending on age, gender, social class, race, and so on and so forth. So we've got the way in which our demographic, our social makeup, will impact on how we read a text. So as I said, a question you can ask here is, are texts shaped by the audience? And what I mean by that is the text that we have, you know, if we have our newspaper article, with its image and so on and so forth, you know, if you have this newspaper article, who determines what's in that newspaper article? Is it the readership? You know, as a reader, when I'm reading a paper or an article on an iPad or whatever, and I read it, and, you know, am I thinking, I agree, you know, I agree with what's been written here, or actually am I saying, no, I fundamentally disagree with what's being written? Which is the publication that I'm more likely to buy again? It's fairly obvious, isn't it, really? You know, if I if I'm reading something, if I read a newspaper article or a magazine article or an internet website or whatever, or I watch a TV programme, and I'm just really in opposition to that, and I think, you know what this person is writing about I just don't agree with, we're probably likely to throw the paper in the bin and not buy that paper again. And so what the writer does, when the writer's here and they're sitting slaving away over the article, they're writing this article here. What they're having to do is make sure that what they write is what the audience want to read. And if they don't, then what they'll find is that readership declines over time, and then this person's out of a job, or the newspaper collapses and folds. And we've seen that. We've seen that in recently with newspapers that have just stopped being read by people. And so these media texts, this text here, is very much shaped by the audience. But we could also say the opposite. We could potentially also say that audiences are shaped by texts. Because if you've got this newspaper article, or this internet web page, or whatever, and it's saying certain things, it's saying certain things about, let's say, immigration, and it's actually saying that immigration is bad, that we should stop immigration. Okay, and we might have some emotive image of someone who's an immigrant, who's from a different country, who's some sort of hooligan. Let's put someone in a burqa, just as that kind of typical image, that stereotypical image of race, and it's really hammering home this idea that immigration is somehow wrong, that illegal immigrants are wrong, and what can also happen is this message then is transferred to the reader, who has in their mind, through reading this article, it looks a bit like a pumpkin, through reading this article, that anyone in a burqa or a hijab is somehow evil and wrong and needs to be banished from the country. So, as well as the idea of this person here being shaped by what this person wants, also what the writer is saying about, or the newspaper says about immigration, can often filter through into the consciousness of the person reading. So we need to bear that in mind, that it's not just about how audiences shape texts, but also what we read can very much determine what we think about the world, or what we think about ourselves. We're fed a diet of magazines that only show stick-thin models, and that's happiness. Then what can also happen is that if we're not stick-thin, if we're overweight, or not necessarily even overweight, if we're just not stick-thin, then we can feel bad about ourselves, because this text is shaping what we perceive to be normal. That if this is normal, then surely we are not normal. So you can see the way that it's not just about this going this way around, it's also about going the other way around. So just bear that in mind when you're analysing non-fiction texts. Okay, well, let's just have a quick thing, a couple of headlines. Just pause, if you want, you can just pause the recording, and then think about, based on what we've just been talking about, what sort of publication you think these two headlines come from. So just pause the video if you want to. It's up to you. And then we will have a think about it. Okay, so straight away we're looking at some of the things that will point us towards the different audience that these are appealing to. And that's what it's about. It's how do they appeal to particular audiences. just bear that word there is probably the most important word in this entire screencast. The idea of how different texts appeal to different audiences and how texts are shaped to appeal to different audiences. Well, straight away, if we look at this top one, we've got this term here. We've got this kind of slang term. It's what we call vernacular. Vernacular is the language of speech. That's what it means. And so this kind of slangy term suggests that the writer feels a certain way about these millionaires. So the audience it's targeting more of a working class audience. Because it's targeting an audience which would read this and see millionaires as being scumbags. And obviously there's this link into Slumdog Millionaires as well, the film Slumdog Millionaires. And again, it would be a certain demographic of person who the newspaper, this is the Sun in this case, the newspaper assumes prior knowledge of the film. So, and that word there actually, sorry, assumes. That word there is a useful word to think about, because what will happen is that a media text or a writer will assume certain things about their audience. And those assumptions will be based on the demographic, will be based on the audience themselves. So here, the use of the slang, the vernacular, the pointing it more towards a working class audience, the linking into a modern film, all suggest the type of publication that would be targeted at a slightly sort of lower middle class or working class readership. And of course it's the Sun. This was from the Sun. If you look at the similar story, very, very different headline, financial crisis, the worst the world has ever faced. There's something much more formal about this. Financial crisis, there's that kind of formal tone. Come on to tone in a bit more detail later. So there's that formal tone there. There's a bit of alliteration, the worst the world. That's a common theme in all media texts, but there's this idea of this text having somehow a global reach. This is much more to do with the kind of appealing to what the readership understand already and know about the subject, linking it maybe into a film that they've seen, and here is much more of a global reach. This one is from the Sun, as I said, and this one from the Telegraph, and we can see the two headlines here. And if you look at the difference, I mean, I've only got a part of the page, but you can see that the page would kind of be here and probably would go down to about there. So that would say the Sun there and so on and so forth. You can see there it really dominates the front page. And look at the fact that it's underlined. This has been capitals. These are the scumbag millionaires here, obviously. And so it's really highlighting in red text. We talked about this with presentational features, but all of these presentational features appeal to the audience. And if you look at the difference here, it's a much smaller headline. It's the biggest headline on the front page, but there's a lot more information going on that page as well. So this is appealing to an audience who maybe take more time to read, who maybe they might be reading on the train on the way to work. Whereas this one is for bite size. People just want news quickly. They want to know the facts quickly, or the newspaper's interpretation of the facts, and they're not too interested in the details. So you can see both as treating a similar story in a very, very different way, and both are assuming different things about their readership, different needs. Okay, the needs here are for detail and focus and a longer term view, and the needs here are for a quick news and just the facts and a bit of juicy opinion, juicy gossip as well. So this is appealing much more to for a very different type of audience to this publication here. Okay, just quickly then to finish off, I'm aware that I'm blathering on a bit. I'm just going to give you a few tips for the exam that I hope will be helpful to you. These are questions. These are questions that I think you should ask yourself when you're in the exam. So first thing, work out what the purpose of the text is. Is it a text which is there to inform? Is it a text which is there to explain something to you? Is it a text which is there to persuade you about something? Is it a text which is supposed to be appealing to kind of the gossip? Is it a cold explanation of the events? So on and so forth. So try and work out first of all what the purpose of the text is, because I think that's quite helpful, because that will enable you to determine audience as well. The impression the title and headline gives you of the subject. Again, we're going on back to presentational features. So think about first impressions. What's your first response to the headline? Look for those presentational features, because presentational features and audience go hand in hand. Different publications will use different presentational features depending on the audience that they're targeting. And again, images, how do the images back this first impression up? That link between image and headline. Again, I spoke about this before. How do they work together? You know, if you've got a headline here, there's your headline, you've got your image there, and there's your text down there. How does that image, and the caption, remember, because there's a caption underneath the picture very often, how does that image link into that headline, and how do you make meaning of the whole thing? You know, how does that meaning, and how does that link into the audience? Why did the writer, editor, etc. choose that combination? Okay, what? Continually ask yourself. You'll have heard me say this before, and it's the reason I'm saying it is because it's so important. You've got to keep asking yourself that question, why? Why did the writer, why did the editor decide on that particular combination of image, caption, headline? What are they trying to say, and what are they assuming about the audience? Okay, what does that then assume about audience? This word here I think is a useful one to have, the idea of what we call a lexical field. And what we mean by that is the group of words, the group and type of language. Or chosen. So it might be that you might have a formal lexical field or an informal. Just think of it actually like a field. Think of it like a field, you know, like a field with a fence around it, and you might have formal language for a publication like the Telegraph, and you might have formal words, and you might have more informal, slangy, vernacular words in a publication like the Sun. So it's literally the words that the words that the writer chooses from is the lexical field. And then if you pick out words and phrases which suggest that lexical field, and then what assumptions again are being made of the audience based on that, then I think that will be really useful. The tone of the piece, that links into the lexical field. The language of the language that's used, the vocabulary, the sentence structure. Often if it's long sentences, the tone might be more relaxed, descriptive. Travel writing often uses lots of long flowing sentences, whereas short sentences can be more urgent, maybe something more aggressive, and can often link into sort of travel writing. And this could be the often can be linking to tabloid journalism. So look at things like the word choice, the lexical field, and also things like sentence length. Are they encouraging? Is the writer encouraging you to think a certain way or feel a certain way about the subject? This is particularly things like persuasive writing, argument. Are they encouraging you to agree with them, usually to agree with them? And how are they doing it? How are they encouraging you to feel and think a certain way about the subject of the article? And then finally, the sort of audience you think the piece is appealing to, based on all that evidence. So based on all the evidence. And it's a process you've gone through. What I've just done then is I've gone through a process, those previous slides. And you need evidence. Don't just say, I think this article appeals to teenagers. You need to say why. Because X, Y, and Z. Never just say that something appeals to a group of people. You must always say why. What are the conscious choices? Okay, what conscious choices has the writer made and the editor? Okay, they don't just hurry off an article without thinking. Every single word choice is carefully chosen. They're writing for their readership, but they're also writing to get published, and the editor will decide based on what they think as to whether or not they'll publish. So just really quickly to finish off then, if we just look at these two magazine covers, there's one for 17 and one for Saga, and we can go through this fairly quickly, and we can see how these different features are important. So again, if we start looking at the language, the language here, dress like a celebrity, make your crush sexy, confidence, party, exclusive Paris, addicted to attention. All of these are suggesting a very young readership. Again, look at the image here. If we're thinking about presentation techniques, the eye contact, which is quite seductive, the kitten, which is appealing, appeals to a younger audience. This kind of selling an image, the earrings, everything here is selling a particular image. The colour, sort of the bright colours, so on and so forth. You can see where I'm coming from here. I won't go into any great detail because I think it's a useful practice for the exam to actually just pick magazine covers at random from the internet, just like I've done, and just spend some time analysing them. Think about what is it about that cover that appeals to the demographic of a 17-year-old girl. Then the real life stories there, and even the fact that the around the outside looks like a kind of diamond picture frame. So all of these things are suggestive of a particular type of a particular demographic. And then if we change to this one, even look at the lighting. This is called high key lighting. The high key lighting is bright, and the high key background, the white background. And then we change it here. There's a little bit of shadow here, which suggests a slightly lower key lighting. The grey background. Again, it's if you look at the combination, they're actually, if you look at the position of the eyes, if we're talking about the presentation techniques, they're still about a third of the way down the page here. They're in roughly the same place, and yet the image itself is a very, very different one. Obviously the older person, rare species, life after Africa, fighting Franco, boats that rocked, first 50 years. All of this has a very different lexical field. It's a very different. If you look at the words themselves, species, Africa, diabetes, Franco, remarkable, so on and so forth, and then compare it to party, hot, confidence, addicted. Very, very different lexical field here to the previous one. Position of the hands important. The colours that are used are much more muted. Even that it's less busy as well. The whole thing is less busy. It's less cluttered. This is quite busy, and there's lots going on here, lots of different colours. Whereas here they're only using orange and white, and the colours themselves are much more muted. So you can see that it's a process that you're going through, and you're thinking, okay, how would this appeal to the audience? Obviously, this is appealing to over 50s, people who are reaching or have retired. This is appealing to kind of girls in their mid to late teens, probably more like mid-teens than late teens, 15, 16, 17 years old. So you can see how and ask yourself the question, how is it appealing to a different audience? Okay. So just quickly then to recap, let's just quickly go through those points again. So the first thing, audiences, texts shape and are shaped by audiences. That it's not just we don't just passively receive the things that we read. We do have some say. We do have some agency, some say in what we read. That writers are appealing to audiences through certain techniques, and they're appealing often to specific audiences. Through the techniques they use. Your job then, in your exam, is essentially to determine three things: the type of text, the audience that it's aimed at, and how it appeals to the audience. Remember, don't just list. Say why. Say why these techniques are used. Okay? Hopefully that will help you.